He's quite big.
Come on, Nando, you can do it. We need a new rug for the house.
Yeah.
I thought you messy beast didn't do this until there was a full moon.
This guy, he just pictures the moon. He's got a great imagination.
I don't know about any of you, but for as long as I can remember, I've always seen werewolves as a bit of a joke. Obviously the idea of a werewolf is scary, and if I ever met one in a dark alley, you'd better be running for the damn hills, but between movies like Van Helsing, What We Do in the Shadows, and Twilight, it was always hard to take the idea of werewolves seriously. But I doubt that was always the case. The concept of werewolves, or at the very least, a human who turns into a beast, has existed for centuries throughout human folklore, and at one point, werewolves likely represented very real fears in our society, like the idea of humans succumbing to primal urges. And even though we've changed through the millennia, werewolves never quite faded out of our imaginations. In modern times, werewolves are easily one of the most popular monsters out there, and while they might not represent fears of our society as well as they used to, we still find them entertaining to this day. You can see examples of this everywhere, from movies, TV, and even video games. But that leads me to the next point. Werewolves as a monster have been popular since time immemorial, there's no denying that. But what about the Wolfman? Many classic monsters can trace their origins back to a prototypical version or versions, and these would later go on to shape our modern idea of these monsters. Vampires have Dracula and Carmilla, mummies have Imhotep and Charis, and Frankenstein's monster has, well, Frankenstein's monster. But it stands to reason that if each of these monsters have an origin, then werewolves, or at least the modern idea of werewolves, must have an original Wolfman somewhere. So like with most of my Halloween projects, I got curious and started asking questions. Who is the original Wolfman? How did he change through the years? Will this research awaken something in me? And lastly, where is the Wolfman now? Stay tuned for answers to these questions and more. So like usual, we gotta wind the clocks back to the 1930s. Universal at this point has been riding the monster movie high with Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. And in order to keep the cash a-flowing, they came up with the next great monster movie, Werewolf of London. This film is notable for being the first feature-length werewolf film, but besides that, this movie's influence is actually rather small in the grand scheme of things. As for the basic plot, the story begins when a botanist, Wilfred London, is attacked by a mysterious beast in Tibet. He's not unscathed, because come on, you've heard the title of the movie, but he's able to return to London with rare flowers in hand. Sometime after his return, he meets a doctor named Yogami, and over the course of their conversations, Yogami explains what a werewolf is, how it can be treated, and all but implies that he was the werewolf that attacked Wilfred in Tibet. Yogami then asks for 2 of the flowers Wilfred brought back, as the flower can be used as an antidote to stop the transformation. Wilfred refuses, but eventually sees Yogami was correct as his body begins changing. The rest of the film covers Wilfred's rampage as he transforms for real, and everything comes to a head in the final act when Wilfred confronts Yogami. Yogami sneaks into Wilfred's lab in an attempt to steal the flowers, but Wilfred transforms mid-struggle and kills Yogami, robbing us of a potential werewolf duel in the process. Man, imagine that, a werewolf v werewolf battle. But after the struggle, Wilfred begins to turn on his wife, until the police arrive just in time and shoot him, killing him in the process. Now, the movie itself is actually not bad at all, and I skipped over a lot of details because they're ultimately not that relevant. But what is relevant is the film's lore on werewolves, and the aforementioned lack of notoriety. What's interesting about this film is that at first, it follows the standard werewolf lore we're all familiar with. A human bitten by a werewolf will transform under a full moon. But something unique to this film is how the lycanthropy can become permanent. According to Yogami, a werewolf must kill someone every time they transform, and if they can't, they'll never become human again. This adds another layer of tragedy to a condition that's already pretty tragic, as a werewolf is torn between killing to retain some humanity, or avoid killing and lose their humanity anyways. But what's also interesting is that in this film, werewolves don't seem to have any special powers, abilities, or even weaknesses. One of the funniest parts of this movie is actually the scene where Wilfred attacks another character, and the other guy just 1v1s him and wins. Like holy witch on the holy night, what a giga chad. And even at the end of the film, the bullet that kills Wilfred seems to be your bog standard bullet, as opposed to anything special whatsoever. And this transitions into the film's greater influence, or rather, the lack of. Unfortunately, this film doesn't have a lot of concrete data available besides Wikipedia blurbs, but I think the fact that there's so little speaks for itself. Don't get me wrong, I think this film was pretty solid all things considered, but when you look at what this film has to offer, it's missing just enough to make a solid impact. For starters, the werewolf in the film has some aspects going for it, but it doesn't feel beastly enough. While this werewolf transforms underneath a full moon, it doesn't really change the person beyond their physical appearance. The defining characteristic of this werewolf is how it needs to kill to avoid a permanent transformation. And while that's interesting in its own right, the werewolf can be dealt with the same way you deal with a normal person, or a normal wolf. And that's not something you want to see in a monster movie. It's a problem with many clear solutions. And in addition to that, the main character of the film feels a bit derivative. Wilfred is like your bog standard scientist character, which had already been done before with Henry Frankenstein, Henry Jekyll, and Jack Griffin, aka the Invisible Man, so having yet another tragic scientist is a little repetitive. Now, this isn't to say the film has no influence, as it did kickstart the trend of werewolves in cinema. But Werewolf of London and its Wolfman, Wilfred Glendon, are rather minor in the greater world of werewolfery, and it's easy to see why Universal didn't bother with him. But what's fascinating is that this isn't all that different to what happened with the Mummy. The Mummy, like the Wolfman, has a prototypical film and monster, but would later have another version that overtakes the original as a quote-unquote definitive version. But where the two monsters differ is how Imhotep, the original Mummy, would reappear many decades later, while Wilfred, the original Wolfman, is relegated to cool trivia you whip out on movie nights. And that leads us right to the next film. Universal may not have seen any potential in Wilfred, but they still saw potential in Werewolves, and it would only take 6 years for Universal to run it back with a new film, The Wolfman. The story begins with us following Lawrence Talbot, a man who returns to his home in Wales following the death of his brother. Sometime later, Larry sees a woman being attacked by a wolf and intervenes, and while he's able to fend off and kill the wolf, he sustains pretty serious injuries in the process. Larry explains the incident to his father, but when the police go to investigate the scene, the dead wolf in question is nowhere to be seen. Instead, they find 2 dead bodies and the weapon Larry used to kill the wolf, which is a cane with a silver wolf head.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
The next day, Larry is asked to recount his story, but everyone doubts his testimony on account of his wounds being healed overnight, while Larry remains adamant about what he saw. Larry is later approached by a Romani woman named Maleva, and she essentially gives Larry and the audience a bullet points about what's happening. In short, Larry was bitten by her son, who was a werewolf, and since Larry was bitten by a werewolf, Larry is now also a werewolf, and it's only a matter of time until he transforms just like her son did. She then gives Larry a charm meant to prevent his transformation, but Larry ends up giving it away because, well, I guess the plot needs to progress somehow. But in that very same evening, as the moon rises, Larry transforms and kills a gravedigger later that night. But when the police arrive on the scene, they notice animal tracks in the vicinity, which leads them to suspect a wild animal is on the loose. The next day, Larry tries to explain that he thinks a werewolf is the culprit, but everyone passes it off as the ramblings of a madman, and Larry himself seems to have no recollection as to what happened in the first place. But as night falls again, Larry transforms once more, and after Maleva uses magic to change Larry back temporarily, he realizes that she was right and that he indeed is a werewolf. Later that same night, Larry explains everything to his father, to which his father responds by strapping Larry to a chair in an effort to prove that it's all in his head. But as the moon rises, Larry transforms, attacks his love interest, and is then beaten to death by his father. As the werewolf dies, Larry's human features come back into focus, and the film ends with the townspeople believing that Larry was killed by a wolf, while John Talbot lives knowing that he killed his own son. Now, compared to Werewolf of London, what immediately stands out is how distinct the Wolfman is, especially in terms of the titular character. While Larry Talbot is more or less just a guy, that does a lot to shift away from the scientist character that was prominent in early horror films. And moreover, while this film doesn't add too much to the wider lycanthropy lore, the additions do make the monster feel, well, more monstrous. Just like Werewolf of London, the Wolfman's lycanthropy occurs when the moon is bright, although the film doesn't specify that it needs to be a full moon. That detail would eventually be retconned in later movies, but essentially, the moon is still an important factor in the transformation. But what the Wolfman does add is a weakness of silver. Now, the idea of werewolves being vulnerable to silver has actually existed long before this movie, and from what I could gather, it's pretty ambiguous as to where the idea originated. But the Wolfman marks the first time where silver is used as a weapon against a werewolf in film, and this will later become a defining aspect of modern werewolf lore. Now, at first glance, giving the werewolf a special weakness doesn't seem like a massive change, and even though Larry seems more imposing than Wilfred, Larry also doesn't display any unusual feats of strength, and his only special power seems to be a healing factor. But the fact that a werewolf needs special equipment makes it feel more monstrous and otherworldly. The 1935 werewolf feels like something within the realms of human understanding, and it can be dealt with in rather conventional means. But the 1941 werewolf feels like something beyond our usual understanding, and if you don't have the knowledge or equipment to deal with it, things can get very bad, very fast. So when you put all this together, the werewolf in the Wolfman feels like a more effective monster compared to the original. It shares some basic traits with the original, but it feels more like an unholy creature that the average person can't deal with, and that's just enough to cement this werewolf as a proper monster. But even though the werewolf in this film was a more effective monster, the actual film does have some weak spots. The romance is absolutely atrocious, and the overt racism is really hard to look past when viewed through a modern lens. And while I think the movie is overall pretty decent, I think many ideas of the film are stronger than their execution. For example, my favorite parts of the movie include the general tone of the last third and the ending, but neither of which is explored to their full potential. The last parts of the movie are essentially Larry going crazy, while almost everyone around him is not taking him seriously, making fun of him, or not being supportive whatsoever. There's a lot of potential for something like, say, a really strong psychological drama, where we see Larry lose his sanity bit by bit as his peers slowly turn on him. The idea of becoming a werewolf is inherently really tragic, so I'd like to see more of that explored in the film. And speaking of tragedy, the way the movie ends is so freaking good. Having a father unknowingly kill his only remaining son is such a bleak, somber ending. And while I think this ending still packs a punch, I think it could have hit even harder if the Talbots were the emotional core of this movie. We don't really get a whole lot on their relationship, but it's apparent that things aren't great, as evidenced by the fact that it took a death in the family to bring them back together. And moreover, while Daddy Talbot is your standard cold and distant father figure, he does care for his son's well-being. He just cares in that old school man's man mentality that isn't healthy for either of them.
The one way for him to get cured is to stay here and fight his way out of this.
I think there's a way to redo this film as a father and son rebuilding a bond, and then having that bond ripped apart by factors outside of their control. I know there's like a million movies out there about fathers and sons, but the movie ends on the sort of thing you'd see in a Greek tragedy, and I'd love to have seen that concept explored further. Man, imagine that, a werewolf movie about fathers and sons. But my point is that there's definitely some material worth refining in this film, and at the end of the day, it is a 1940s horror movie about werewolves. You don't walk into McDonald's expecting a 5-star burger. But it's safe to say that unlike Werewolf of London, the Wolfman became the werewolf movie. Not only was this film a critical and commercial success, but the character was so popular that he'd go on to appear in 4 more films, beginning with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and ending with, coincidentally, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Sadly, Larry wouldn't get another solo film for a long time, but he was always on call for team-ups, so in a way, we owe the current media landscape to good old Larry Talbot. But even though Larry took a break in 1948, he'd make another appearance many decades later, which brings us to his final movie so far, The Wolfman, 2010. As the title implies, The Wolfman is a remake of the 1941 film, and as such, it very much follows the same plot as the original. Larry Talbot returns home following the death of his brother, he meets a love interest, connects with his father, and is eventually bitten by a werewolf. While there are some differences, the only one worth mentioning is a subplot involving the death of Larry's mother, and the basic blueprint is essentially the same as the 1941 version, for about half the movie. At around the halfway point, like in the original, Larry goes in a downward spiral and starts looking for answers. He stumbles on a mysterious shrine devoted to his mother, and as he investigates further, he runs into his father, who explains how the darkest hours of Larry's life are just beginning. But as Talbot Sr. leaves, he locks Larry in the shrine, and reveals that he too is a werewolf.
Okay, but that's worse. I mean, you do get how that's worse, right?
Look, I walked into this movie cautiously optimistic, but at this point, all that goodwill just went out the window. The rest of the movie is basically a back-to-back volley of werewolf action scenes, none of which are very good, and all of which culminate in a werewolf duel between father and son. And honestly, there's a lot of things you could critique with this film, from the aforementioned action, the changes, or the general storyline, but I think this film's biggest pitfall is how excessive it is. While the original Wolfman isn't perfect, I'd say the foundation of the film is actually quite solid. The film has elements of a slow burn horror, a monster thriller, a psychological drama, and a Greek tragedy, and nothing really needs to be changed. You just need to add enough to refine what was already there, like adding more depth to the character relationships, or highlighting the inherent tragedy of Larry's condition. But the 2010 film said f that and just added and added and added. The slow burn horror of the original? Gone. Have some jump scares and gratuitous gore. A tight 70-minute monster flick? Nope, let's make the film almost 2 hours long and do nothing noteworthy with the runtime. What about the psychological drama with Larry's condition? Oh yeah, that's improved a little. Just kidding, have some flashbacks, torture scenes, and werewolf carnage. The film just keeps adding more and more, and these additions barely offer any benefit whatsoever. The most glaring example of this is with the addition of Talbot Sr.'s lycanthropy, and on paper, you can somewhat understand why this was added. In the film, there's some subtext about generational trauma and abuse, which is evident in the way Larry talks about his father, and the way the first part of their final confrontation is framed. You can tell this movie is trying to tell a story about how abuse shapes who we are, and how we have the choice to let our trauma consume us, or strive to be better. But the key phrase is trying, and the way this theme was handled is just so laughably bad. Generational trauma is a very complicated topic, and that's because the feelings for those involved are often very complicated, like the anger and sadness that develops from abuse, the way abuse shapes your other relationships, or that lingering, irrational affection for those who treated you horribly. My point is that it takes a lot of effort to explore that topic with proper depth and nuance, and needless to say, this film fails to do so. Everything is delivered in the most over-the-top way, from the comically tragic backstory of Talbot Sr. murdering his entire family, to the final battle that lacks any weight whatsoever. I could easily see a version of this film that explores the complicated relationship between a grieving father, a distant, traumatized son, and how that relationship affected not only each other, but the relationships around them, building to a final confrontation with true emotional weight and depth. But hey, maybe that's on me for reading too much into a goddamn werewolf movie. But to make a long story shorter, the 2010 Wolfman is hot garbage. I thought the 2017 Mummy was rock bottom, but I learned a valuable lesson in how things could always get worse. This movie was a serious case of the monkey's paw curling, as we did eventually get a werewolf v werewolf fight, and a werewolf movie about fathers and sons, just not in the way I expected or wanted. But it seems I'm not the only person who feels negatively about this film. The 2010 Wolfman was a box office bomb, and not only was it destroyed by critics, but the president of Universal at the time even said it was, in his words, one of the worst movies we ever made. So with the double whammy of a poor box office gross and poor critical reception, poor Larry was thrown back into cinema limbo, and he's remained there for the past decade or so. And normally, this is the part where I try to figure out what happened to the Wolfman, but I think this case is a little more straightforward. Larry had a really solid run in the 40s, and while he never got a solo film after his debut, he was around long enough to cement himself as an icon. But after 1948, what happened to Larry is what happens to every icon eventually. Unlike some of his peers, Larry doesn't have source material to keep him relevant through the ages, and his only relevance lies in what we see on the silver screen. So, without a steady stream of movies, it was only natural for Larry to fade into the background as time passed. He wasn't the first, nor would he be the last. But I think Larry is also a victim of what he is. Werewolves as a concept have been around long before any one Wolfman, and at the end of the day, the idea of werewolves is so much bigger than one man. While classic films may have brought werewolves into the public eye, the idea of werewolves doesn't need a singular man or woman anymore, and it's debatable if it ever needed one in the first place. Like I said earlier, humans have always been fascinated by the idea of werewolves, and even though Wilfred Glendon and Larry Talbot have made their mark on film history, they're largely just footnotes in the greater world of lycanthropy. As for what's next for Larry, well, it remains to be seen. While the Wolfman has been dormant since 2010, I don't think it'll take much to bring him back. All it takes is one high quality film to make a difference, and I put heavy emphasis on high quality. Werewolves are already popular, and there's a lot of material in the older films that's brimming with potential. Body horror, personal tragedy, social issue allegories, the list goes on, and all it takes is the right talent to make that movie a reality. Would that movie ever come to fruition? Well, maybe or maybe not, only time will tell. But as fate would have it, we might have an answer sooner than we think. While the Dark Universe may have crashed and burned, there has been another resurgence in monster movie reimaginings, like a Nosferatu remake by Robert Eggers, a Frankenstein adaptation by Guillermo del Toro, and last but certainly not least, a Wolfman remake by Leigh Whannell. Now, at the time of this recording, none of these films are officially out yet, and just like past movies, there's a real chance each film could end up as more garbage. There is precedent. But given the talent behind each project, I'm willing to bet that things might be different this time around, and if everything goes as well as I hope, we could be in for a new era of classic movie monsters.